The Indian FTR Sport will replace the previous FTR S from 2023, and I tested how much sport is actually in this bike for you here in Brno on the racetrack, because I always think that what performs well on the racetrack is naturally suitable for the country road anyway, strengths and weaknesses starkly revealed. For the sporty appearance of the FTR 1200 Sport, the name says it all. The 2023 has, of course, also been visually adapted a little. There is now a new plate here. Incidentally, I think this white color fits very well here. The side panels have been changed a little. I think they've been able to achieve a really sporty look with small, subtle adaptations, even with this pillion cover. Of course, this looks a bit like the flat racker style, where the start numbers are stuck on. So yes, we are staying true to this flat rack idea. Although it has to be said that it has already undergone an update in 2021, where they have moved away from this classic flat rack 18-inch range from a more typical, let's say, naked bike-oriented 17-inch tires. And I have to say that this difference was, of course, very noticeable. It was noticeable in the turning behavior, but also in the stability of the vehicle in general. And now I've gotten used to it a bit. These 17-inch wheels have got me hooked. And what I really appreciate about this FTR 1200 Sport is that it also has a fully adjustable suspension. And that's something I've been looking into, but maybe a bit more on that later. For all those who may not yet be familiar with this FTR 1200, there are several model variants. There is the standard, the sport, the rally, and then the carbon as the top-end product, so to speak. The carbon is in principle a little more refined with, as the name suggests, carbon fairing parts and a fully adjustable oil in suspension. We have a fully adjustable suspension, as I said, but this is now from Sachs ZF. But more on that later. Yes, basically, what do we have? A 1200 CET 60-dig V2, actually a cruiser engine, you have to say. So you have to think a bit about where the vehicle fits in. For me, it's not a classic naked bike, but it's not a cruiser either. It's a muscle bike. So what the Ford Mustang is to me among cars, the FTR 1200 Sport is to me among bikes. And that's how I would classify it. But the riding qualities are really hard to beat. I have to admit, I've never ridden it on the racetrack. I have ridden them on the road. With the previous model, but on the racetrack, I thought to myself, well, let's see what's really in there in terms of performance. But the basic ingredients, to perhaps continue briefly here, are really okay. The front brakes are quite sporty and crisp. Brembo monoblock brake calipers with a 320mm disc. That's really good. Also, the Metzeler Sportec M9RR tires. The tire also fits the vehicle well, and to trim the setup here for the racetrack a bit so that you feel comfortable and that it fits, I also adjusted the tire pressure in the morning. I went down about 0.2 of a bar at the front and rear. It's just that the tires warm up anyway, and this bike has enough pressure and power, 125 horsepower, 118 Newton meters. It's really powerful, especially at low revs and also in the middle of the engine. But the reviness is not neglected. So the engine fires, fiery through the torque curve, and I probably catch myself almost hitting the limiter far too often. Of course, you notice a small disadvantage, especially when coming out of corners. The bandwidth or what the engine provides, i.e. the revs, is of course not all that generous. So you really have to shift gears diligently and keep the thing happy via the gears, properly sorted and always with the throttle open. To perhaps go into a little more detail now, what else have I done? The suspension, I've said it for the third time now. So I actually got the slotted screwdriver and tried out how this adjustability actually works. And you have to say it's not some kind of pseudo-adjustable suspension. There is something like that on the market. There really is something going on. So in the standard trim, as it comes from the factory, I realized that it was just far too bumpy. I was riding it like that and there was far too much movement. Now I've gone and closed everything completely, compression, rebound, and then opened it 2 clicks at a time. And you could already tell, okay, There's real damping in there now, and this oscillating behavior is gone. So that was really okay. Yes, and if we then take a look at the rear suspension, there's also a fully adjustable damper with a piggyback construction. So there's an expansion tank at the rear. I also went there and completely closed the rebound and compression, and then opened them up 5 clicks at a time, because otherwise the rear end was too firm for me. And that was the setup that I actually used for the next 3 turns, where I thought to myself, okay, in combination with the slightly reduced air pressure, it was really, really difficult. Of course, you notice when you're driving that it's a heavy vehicle. So I think India is 137 kilograms with a full tank. Of course, that's more than a classic, comparably naked Biki, such as the Super Duke, which also has a large V2 engine with 200 cubic centimeters or more. You have to say, almost 25-30 kilos heavier. And you notice that a little, especially when you enter a corner, the weight is there. It's a little noticeable in the handling. It accelerates a little when things get really sporty. But I wouldn't say that it's so negative that it's a knockout criterion, because the rest of the vehicle simply offers really, really sporty riding, even the lean angle, something that is always criticized a bit with this FTR, because as soon as the footrest touch down on the right, there's still a little bit of lean. It feels like 2 or 3 centimeters, and then comes the manifold, or rather the exhaust, and when it touches down, it levers the bike out. But India states on the website 40 degrees of lean angle, and I have to say it felt a bit more than that. So when the footrest touches down, you really have a nice feeling when the thing is in the radius. And then you can circle over it a bit. But of course, physics comes into play somewhere. There is a physical limit, but it's enough to be fast, and it's enough to have fun. What other key data do we have on it that's worth mentioning? I don't think I've mentioned the seat height yet. India specifies a seat height of 780 millimeters. You sit really comfortably on it. But what I like, I'll position myself briefly for you. It's the position of the footrests. It's not typical for cruisers. This footrest system is very far forward. No, you have to say that it's actually positioned relatively centrally below the seat. And this results in a really sporty knee angle. Absolutely suitable for gymnastics, I think. So not overly acute, but you can already see here that it simply allows an active riding position. And if you then take your upper body forward with you and take hold of the wide handlebars, then you can steer it really nicely into the radius. And the whole thing, the experience was simply much sportier than I had almost imagined. Otherwise, the rake is relatively steep. The wheelbase is extremely lengthy. So over 1,500 millimeters of wheelbase. That's actually significantly more than this classic naked bike category has. But yes, that simply results in this precise, or I should say precise, riding performance for this vehicle class. And that's good. Let's continue a little further with electronic things. So we have an IMU inside, lean angle dependent traction control, and ABS too, of course. The display is new 2023. It's now a round instrument. On the old ones, it was a square rectangular instrument. It can be operated both via touch and via the control element here on the left, so via the joystick. The loading times are a little lengthy. So you notice that when you starter the bike, until the thing has really started up, you can't be in a hurry to get out quickly for the next turn. You have to give it a few seconds and almost minutes. So that's a bit difficult. You really have to stop there. But I think it's probably 30 seconds until the thing is really inside the display. But the range of functions, to come to the positive side, is really enormous. I have a nice navigation view in there, so I can also call up the navigation. I think it's relatively intuitive to use with the touch screen. The joystick, once you get to grips with it, it works, and I have to say I found my way around it really well. I even have cruiser control on board here. Not on the racetrack, of course, but India really has a very, very complete package. And so I really enjoyed it. And now, dear viewers, of course, whenever I'm at the racetrack, I have buddies with me. And what made me particularly happy was Fabian Schnuffi. You may already know him. He was also on the track with me. He also drove with India. And of course, I'm looking forward to his opinion. Fabian, you're in the spotlight. Come to me. No, not in the rain. We'll still make it into the dry, right? Fabian, I announced it loud and clear. You're a real racer, of course, and have a lot of experience on the racetrack. Was this your first time on the track with the FTR, or did you already have some previous experience with it?
No, it was actually the first time on the racetrack. We've tested it a few times on the country road, of course. That's where the bike belongs. That's where we tested it. But it was an interesting experience on the racetrack and not as bad an experience as I thought it would be.
I felt the same way there. I thought the same thing when I saw it in the editorial plan. Of course, Boki said, Max, you're testing it on the racetrack in Brno. And I thought to myself, Brno, this fast track there with a bike like that. But this thing is really incredibly sporty. And I already mentioned that in the intro. For me, it's always the same when a bike performs well on the racetrack, because for me, the racetrack is the place that mercilessly reveals strengths and weaknesses. Then, of course, it fits for the road anyway. And I've already philosophized a bit about the adjustable suspension and so on. But perhaps you'd like to share your impressions again, Fabian. How did you perceive the ride with it? Suspension, brakes, engine? Share your experiences with us.
Yes, all right. Let's maybe start with the engine. So the V12. The V12 is, of course, a great engine, a mechanically great engine. The FTRs always have a little bit of a problem with constant compression and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter on the racetrack because it's full throttle. And it's nice that the engine likes revs. It really wants to rev up. It's not the kind of V2 you would expect. It really is a nice revving engine. But then the rev limiter comes relatively suddenly. So it's not as if you could feel the power dropping off like that. And yes, now I could change gear. Instead, the thing really pulls up to the limiter. But yes, once you've got the shift points, I have to say I found the engine really good. And it also has really nice power and enough power here for the racetrack. What else can I tell you? Chassis, riding performance. I think that Brno as a wide, fast track suits the FTR a bit because it's a very lengthy bike. Yes, of course, it's also a heavy bike, but it's not such a small circuit where agility is extremely important, where you often have to change gear very quickly. You often have to change gear, but it's not so abrupt now. And I think the track itself suits the FTR very well. The bike is nice and stable in lean angles and also really at high speed, especially here. If you know Brno, first corner, first right, you brakes in for a long time. Then you feel like you're riding around on the right flank forever. And the FTR gives you a really nice feeling, and the tire too. So you know that the M9 is good, but it's good here. I mean, now it's wet and cold, but it was about 15 degrees, and I thought the feeling was really okay. Problem then, of course, maximum lean angle. You must have mentioned that, right?
Yes, I did address it. India states 45 degrees in the brochure, and that's also why I think that Brno is somehow, as we expect, very good here. Because when you're sitting on the foot pegs and actually realize that I want to tighten the line and then have to go wide, then you're grateful for a wide track. And Brno is, of course, fantastic on the narrow Pannonia Ring. It might have been a bit tight for me in one or two corners, especially the first two turns, but maximum lean angle is of course an issue. And then the manifold comes at some point. I think you've also had the odd experience in the editorial office.
At the Tuner Grand Prix in Hockenheim, a custom-built FTR once landed rudely in the tire pile because the exhaust manifold eventually leveraged out. That wasn't so nice, so you just have to be a bit careful with the lean angle, especially when you're really trying to jump deep into the bend. Then you can brake, then you have a bit more pressure on it, then the whole bike is a bit lower, and then the detent just comes a bit earlier.
Talking about brakes, I found it surprisingly good. 320 double disc, Brembo monoblock. Performance-wise, it didn't let up here on the racetrack either.
No, it hasn't given in at all. It's not an overly harsh bite, but it's nice dosage. You have good lever travel, so you don't have a really hard lever. It's a bit soft but comfortable, so I think it's deliberately tuned that way. And it's also very resistant. We also drove a turn here in a single go. And of course, you don't have 300 to 0 braking. But when you drive here in Brno, the brakes are already stressed. And it held up well. Then we move on to the suspension while we're on the subject of brakes. Like every road bike, the FTR is also subject to the fact that if you brake hard into a corner, you will overstress the fork at some point. And that the bike then tilts inwards a bit when you press the brakes, when you release them. So basically it fights back a bit. But with the FTR, this is really much less than I imagined. So you really have to say that you don't have any unpleasant tipping. But at some point you have this knowledge that the bike is going to move a little bit inwards when you release the brakes. And you can dose that really nicely.
And I think you get used to the effect relatively quickly, so I can fully understand what you've just described. I felt the same way. I noticed that, but somehow after the third round, I thought to myself, okay, that's just how it reacts. And then you know what's going on, and you can actually deal with it relatively well from my point of view without running the risk of doing anything stupid.
Yes, from my point of view too, definitely. And I mean, you did the setup this morning. So it worked great, optimal. I wouldn't have changed anything about the thing now.
As I said, I turned it around a bit twice. Of course, I'm not this suspension guru either. I just noticed on the first ride that there was far too much oscillation, and then I tightened both the compression and rebound. Just 2 clicks at the front. At the rear, it was 5 clicks in each case because the rear was much firmer than the front anyway. But of course, depending on the tires, temperature, and so on, you could certainly fine-tune it a lot more. But for someone who I think just wants to experience racetracks with the thing, they're not going to maybe look that hard at the suspension either. But for someone who just wants to experience the racetrack with this thing, I think they can. And the suspension is up to the task. So the adjustment range is really good. Yes, Fabian, is there anything else you would like to mention?
I don't think so. There was one thing I found funny. When I looked into the cockpit 2-3 times during brakes, the traction control wildly displayed something, and I thought, oh shit, has it failed or not? But when you downshift hard, the traction control seems to do something. I don't know exactly what it's trying to do or what that's supposed to mean, but yes, you shouldn't let it confuse you.
And it's the same with the riding modes. I also had a bit of an aha experience there at the beginning because there's standard and sport in terms of power delivery. And I was riding in this standard mode for the first few turns. And at lean angles, it only picks up throttle very, very cautiously. So the moment when you, as a reasonably experienced hobby racer, think, okay, now comes the point where you can start to pull, where you can simply push the rear wheel a bit, then it feels like it only takes half the throttle that you actually want to send to the rear. In sport mode, it was a bit better, but I would still criticize it and say that it feels a bit synthetic on the throttle. How did you feel about it? Did you notice it too? Or was that just something where I seem to be too oversensitive?
Nah. I didn't really have that problem. I know what you mean and I can understand it. I generally found it more difficult to find the feeling for how you can put weight on the rear wheel because the rear wheel is somehow far away from where you're sitting. And that's why the feeling for the rear wheel in general wasn't that great because, as I said, the bike is lengthy and you're sitting kind of far away from the rear wheel. But yes, well, with all standard traction controls that are lean angle dependent, it's actually the case that more would be possible in a lean angle. Of course, it's designed for the road. I mean, the tire is at the perfect temperature here. We have good asphalt. So I think the setup is better for the general sports rider on the road.
Definitely. So for the general sports rider on the road, you've delivered the boot, certainly perfect. And it's also really sporty. And I was just surprised how sporty on the race track as well, Fabian. But at this point, I would like to say thank you very much. I really enjoyed the fact that we were both able to step on the throttle and that you added your expertise. And yes, we are slowly but surely coming to a conclusion. And so we can summarize that the Indian FTR 1200 Sport definitely lives up to its name, which I asked myself at the beginning of the test. And perhaps interesting for all those who might want to buy it, test ride it, take a closer look at the model. The price, it's 12,190 euros. That's where it starts in Germany. In Austria and Switzerland, it's a bit more, of course. I have to say, it seems fair to me. It is, of course, a lot of bike, high-quality components. Even the details in the workmanship. Yes, the brake lines are steel-braided, the levers, everything is nicely adjustable. So it looks high quality and has been carefully designed. So I have to say that today was a real eye-opener for me. I really enjoyed it here in the saddle, and it was much more than you would have expected at first. And yes, that's it. Let me know how you like it, what you think of the FTR's 1200. Maybe you've already had some experience with it or even been to a track day. Of course, I'm always happy to receive your comments, and I also appreciate a thumbs up from you. So please like our channel, subscribe to the channel, and like the video. And with that, I say goodbye to the unfortunately rainy Brno. A beautiful morning, but unfortunately a somewhat wet afternoon. Let's see, maybe the sun will come out later. But in the meantime, best wishes to you at home from Brno.